Welcome back, everyone. It is finally time for us to talk about the two most fundamental forms of plot structure, comedies and tragedies. These two forms of plot were first described by my least favorite philosopher, Aristotle, when talking about the two most common types of Greek plays. They were the two types of plots that Aristotle was personally fond of, and as a result of writing it down and talking about them so much, became the two types of plots that everyone cared about. They're the two types of plots that deal primarily with real-world struggles. Comedy, for example, will deal with the struggles of regular people, whereas tragedy will deal with big issues. These big issues are at the heart of both comedies and tragedies, but they're differentiated based on the types of problems that arise and the way that they function in the story. These problems are the bad stuff that happens in the story. In comedy, those problems happen at the beginning of the story, and they're the thing that has to be resolved in order for the story to end. In tragedies, however, the bad stuff happens at the end of the story. It is the natural conclusion to all of the choices the protagonists have made throughout the story, and the bad stuff is their comeuppance, their punishment, or just the bad luck that they encounter. It's not just when in the story the bad stuff takes place that distinguishes comedies and tragedies, it's what those issues are in the first place. In comedies, the bad stuff is a serious but relatively common problem. It's a family quarrel with no easy solution. It's losing a bunch of money on a bad business decision. It's being defamed and losing reputation because something embarrassing happened to you or a family member. And of course, most commonly, it's a fight between two lovers. These are all problems that are generally relatable. They're issues that we face all the time, even if not personally, we know people who have these problems. And so the point of the comedy isn't the problem itself, it is how the problem is resolved. It is how the protagonists understand the problem and reach a solution. In tragedies, however, the stakes for the bad stuff is a lot higher. They are people dying and they are kingdoms falling. And so with the tragic plotline, there is no solving the problem. There is no overcoming the issues. People die and that is it. And so with tragic storylines, there's no recovery from the bad stuff. There's no fixing the problems. Once the person is dead, they are dead forever. And if they come back to life, it's not a tragic story anymore. And so the bad stuff in tragedy functions as the final hammer that brings the point of the story home. All of the choices that protagonists make, though they may seem like the right choice at the time, when taken all together, inevitably lead to this path that they weren't supposed to walk on. And so the tragic bad stuff happens almost like a warning shot to the audience of why you shouldn't pursue these choices, about why you shouldn't make such decisions. The protagonist of a tragic storyline makes choices. They make an explicit decision and overextend their reach, and the bad stuff happens because of that. And so without further ado, let's talk about how these plot lines work. Now I should mention that the comedy plot line is not necessarily related to the comedy genre, although the two generally borrow from each other. If you take movies like The Hangover or Dude, Where's My Car, they follow the quest storyline in a comedic fashion. In fact, you can do funny tellings of all of these plot lines, except maybe tragedies. And so comedic plot lines aren't necessarily funny. One of the most classic pieces of literature and reasons why fanfiction is legitimate media, The Divine Comedy, is a comedy despite the fact that it is not funny in the slightest. It actually is a little bit funny, but not intentionally. And so for comedic plot to work, there's a few things that have to happen. First, the story either opens with bad stuff happening or describes bad stuff that has already happened. A family is going through a rough time, a person is down on his luck, or lovers are quarreling over one reason or another. From that point on, the entire plot of the comedy is finding a resolution to this problem. The characters gain a deeper understanding of what the problem was and why it came about, and then the characters go through the personal growth and make all of the decisions needed to make that problem go away for one reason or another. Whether that involves exiling the person who is the source of the problem or finding a way to reach a resolution where none could be found earlier. It is a simple structure and quite possibly the most basic of the basic plots, but it's this simpleness that gives it such an open-ended structure. There are countless problems that people can face and even more ways that you can find solutions to those problems. And so you can do quite a bit with a comedic plotline. So long as you have a problem, you make the characters understand what that problem is, and then give them a way of solving it. Tragedies, by comparison, are a little bit more strict on the way that they have to be structured. Whereas comedies begin with bad stuff, tragedy ends with it. So the beginning of the tragedy usually foreshadows that bad stuff that's going to happen. And so tragic storylines usually begin with a temptation, with a protagonist having the opportunity to gain something they didn't have before, whether that be power, wealth, or influence. The plot from that point forward is about the protagonist trying to accomplish this goal. They start with an ambition and then they go about the steps needed to bring that ambition to life. Unlike things like the quest storyline and overcoming the monster, this goal that the protagonists have is rarely something that is unarguably a good thing to accomplish. It is usually but not always a selfish ambition, something that benefits the protagonist exclusively. But more than that, it is the way that the goal is accomplished that leads this to a tragic ending. Tragedies usually create this idea of a point of no return. In the quest to accomplish these ambitions, the protagonists usually make a string of choices that are morally questionable. They sometimes backstab old friends, they sometimes lie to people for personal gains, and occasionally they go a little bit too far. That point of no return usually involves killing or completely destroying the life of a rival or a competitor for that goal. It is often an act that we would see as unsavory or just plain wrong. Once they complete this terrible action, that goal is within reach. At the same time, however, that terrible action usually creates a string of events that leads to their downfall. In Macbeth, killing Banquo is often seen as that point of no return because it is a way to try and solidify his power in opposition to the prophecy that his children would not succeed him on the throne. However, it's also possible that when Macbeth orders the killing of Macduff's family, that is the point of no return, for it is that action that unites all of Macbeth's enemies against him and directly leads to his demise. So the point of no return is important in the tragic storyline because it is the point where the protagonist crosses the line between morally questionable to morally wrong, and as a result justifies all of the bad stuff that happens to him. It makes the audience feel like that bad stuff is deserved. And so it is this final terrible action that the protagonist commits that leads to a sequence of events that brings a bunch of bad stuff to the protagonist that makes it impossible for him to accomplish his goal. Whether that's because the goal no longer exists, or that he's no longer eligible for completing the goal, or that the protagonist is dead now. Tragedies as a whole explore the importance of the choices that you make. They argue that the end doesn't justify the means, for if you'd make a bunch of terrible choices trying to accomplish a goal, a bunch of terrible things will happen to you. There is, however, a different type of tragedy I'd like to talk about as well. It's the Hegelian tragedy, first described by the German philosopher Hegel. A philosopher that I have much fewer problems with than I do with Aristotle. Hegel describes this idea of tragedy as a conflict between two opposing sides. The Hegelian tragedy is very similar to the Aristotelian tragedy in that there is a goal that the protagonist is trying to accomplish. However, in the Hegelian tragedy, there is another person looking to accomplish that goal as well, and the conflict between these two people trying to accomplish the same goal leads to a tragic outcome. Whether it's two people competing to marry one person, or it's two nations fighting for one resource, or it's two families vying for the throne. It's a situation wherein both parties really want this goal, but only one can have it. The bad stuff that happens in this tragedy is usually a result of the conflict either completely eliminates one side, or both of them are eliminated, or the goal is destroyed. These tragedies tend to focus on the terrible and sometimes inevitable loss that comes as a result of conflict. It is functionally similar to the Aristotelian tragedy, but doesn't function as a warning against being too ambitious, but rather tends to address the inevitability of bad stuff in a world where two people will compete for a goal that only one of them can have. So as you might have noticed, comedies and tragedies are very similar in structures. It is often said that tragedy is the reverse of comedy and vice versa. And that's easy to see based on the fact that in tragedies you have your bad stuff happening at the end, and in comedies you have your bad stuff happening at the beginning. Sometimes they're mapped out, whereas a comedy, a bunch of bad stuff happens right away, and then eventually they reach a solution that, gets them back to where they were, or maybe a little better than they were before. In tragedies, a bunch of good stuff happens as the protagonist gets closer and closer to achieving their goal, and then a bunch of bad stuff keeps happening, and then they just get completely in a situation where they cannot accomplish that goal anymore. It is also said that comedy is a tragedy that happens over time. A bunch of bad stuff happening to a character over and over and over again generally gives you a comedic storyline. Think of every Mr. Bean episode. A bunch of bad stuff happening over and over and over again is a comedic storyline, if for no other reason that you have to be around and doing stuff in order for bad stuff to happen to you, and tragedies usually end with the protagonist being unable to act. Nevertheless, comedies and tragedies are two of the most prevalent storylines that we face, because almost every real-world story we look at follows one of these plot lines, if it's not one of the rags to riches storylines. And so with that, hopefully you understand a little bit more about how they operate and a little bit more about what they have in common. If you have any questions, let me know down there. And if you like what you see, give us a like or subscribe. Thank you for watching this episode of the Young Writers Vlog. Until next time, make sure to keep on writing.